Hey everyone, I'm Kash Patel from Ambit. I'm a technical customer success manager here, and in this video, I'll be walking you through how Ambit works with Azure Databricks pipelines. Before we get into the demo, I want to briefly frame the problem that we're solving. Many Databricks pipelines today are configured with plain text Azure Service Principal credentials, client IDs and secrets stored directly in pipeline configuration or environment variables. These secrets are often long-lived, hard to rotate, and can create real risk if they're ever exposed. So what I'm going to show you is how Ambit acts as a trust broker to completely eliminate those secrets from your pipeline configuration. No secrets stored anywhere in the pipeline, and no changes needed to your target services. A common pattern we see in enterprises is Databricks pipelines configured with plain text Azure Service Principal credentials, client IDs and secrets that need to be removed from pipeline configuration. I'll be demonstrating how Ambit bridges that gap. We're going to execute outbound pipeline calls from Databricks, one to the Azure Graph API, and one to Salesforce, without storing any Azure Service Principal secrets or Salesforce secrets within the pipeline itself. For each of these scripts, I've got them broken into 4 steps so it's easy to follow. Let me walk you through the logic before we run it. So for the first step, we call the Azure Instance Metadata Endpoint. And this allows us to retrieve the compute nodes underlying Azure Managed Identity Token. This is a standard Azure capability. The cluster itself has a managed identity assigned to it, and we're simply fetching that token in this first step. Now in step 2, we send that cluster's Azure Managed Identity Token to Ambit to prove the pipeline's identity. Ambit cryptographically verifies the token against the trust provider we've configured and returns a short-lived Ambit session token. The pipeline never touches the secret, it only presents the identity it already has. Now in step 3 of the script, we use that Ambit session token and the pipeline requests access to the Graph API. Ambit performs a policy evaluation. Does this workload have the right to access this endpoint? And if the policy matches, it dynamically interacts with Entra through workload identity federation and returns a short-lived OAuth token issued by a service principal that has access to the Graph API. The pipeline never had to know or store that service principal's secret. In the final step, step 4, the pipeline uses that ephemeral OAuth token to make the call to the Graph API. This is the only place the token exists, and it's short-lived. So let me run this now. I'll make the font a bit bigger so it's easier to see. And I can walk you through the output. So here's the identity token that we get back from Azure. I've decoded it to show you the claims that are available for matching. For simplicity in this demo, I'm matching on the resource ID of the managed identity that is assigned to the cluster. But you can key off of any claim in this token. This is a specific claim that I'm matching against for this demo. Then we request access to a short-lived credential to the Graph endpoint. We take that identity token, use it to authenticate to Ambit, and get an Ambit access token back. At this point in the flow, we've proved the identity of the workload, and Ambit has authorized it to request the credential it needs based on policy. Then, using the Ambit session token, we request access to a short-lived credential to the Graph endpoint using the Ambit access token from step 2. This is an OAuth token issued by the service principal that has access to Graph. This credential was never stored in the pipeline. And here's the result. We've successfully called the Graph API and listed users from our Entra ID directory. No secrets, no hard-coded credentials. Now, I want to show you something important for your use case. The difference between cluster level and pipeline level identity. The first demo used the shared managed identity of the cluster. Any pipeline running on that cluster would get the same identity. This next script adds a process identifier to isolate down to a specific pipeline. This process identifier can be the pipeline name, the job name, or any dynamic value you want. I've got it statically set for the purpose of this demo. The core flow is identical. We get an Azure token, pass it to Ambit, get back a service principal token, but Ambit can now distinguish this specific pipeline from others running on the same cluster. That means you can apply different access policies per pipeline. So I'll go ahead and run this second script. Now you'll see the same kind of output as we saw in the prior script. Get the Azure token, we authenticate using it to Ambit, we get the session token back, we make the request for the credential for the Graph API, and then we're able to successfully make the request. Same output, successful Graph API call, but later I'll show you in the Ambit console how this was logged under a distinct client identity attributed back to the specific pipeline. Now for the final script, here's what I think is really neat. The same secretless flow works for third-party SaaS, not just Azure services. This script uses the same pipeline level attestation as before, but instead of calling the Graph API, we're calling a Salesforce tenant. The only difference is in the last step. Instead of doing a token exchange with Entra, Ambit does a token exchange with Salesforce using its authorization code flow. The pipeline still sees the same pattern, gets an Azure token, gets the Ambit session token, uses it to request a credential, but the credential it gets back is a Salesforce access token. So I'll go ahead and run this and we can walk through the output. So similar pattern as before, we get the Azure token, we use it to authenticate to Ambit, and then we use that session token we get back from Ambit to request a Salesforce credential. And there it is. We've called the Salesforce API and retrieved organization information from our demo tenant. Same secretless flow, different target service. This generalizes to any third-party service that supports OAuth. Now let me bring up the Ambit console to show you how all of this is configured. Everything you just saw is driven by these access policies. Here are the client workloads. These two up here represent the Databricks pipelines we just ran. Each is identified by its attestation attributes, like the ones seen here. In this case, it's the managed identity, resource ID, and the pipeline process name. One thing worth noting for the client identification side, in my demo, I'm just keying off of one claim in the token. However, Ambit supports a full range of identifiers. These are across cloud platforms, Kubernetes, and any OIDC compatible service. You can even add custom claims, use audience or subject or issuer claims, or combine multiple identifiers to get as granular as you need. The more identifiers you add, the tighter the scope. This is the trust provider. It's what validates the Azure OIDC token coming from the cluster. This is where you define which claims Ambit should match on. And these are the credential providers. The trust provider is how we validate what's coming in from the client. The credential provider is how we generate what we give back. One is tied to our Azure Service Principal, which you can see here, and the other to the Salesforce OAuth application. And here are the target services or endpoints the access policies are granting access to. One for the Graph API and one for the Salesforce tenant. We've also got access conditions, and this is really worth pointing out. In the policies I'm using, I have a simple geo-based access condition, which only allows requests originating from the US. But you can layer additional conditions as your requirements grow. I've walked you through how to use the Ambit UI to configure access policies. And for teams that manage infrastructure as code, we also have a Terraform provider. So as new pipelines onboard, you can automate policy creation rather than clicking through the UI each time. Finally, let me show you how logging works in Ambit. Ambit provides various types of logs. One of them is the audit log. This captures all human and administrative actions, such as who created a trust policy, who modified an access rule, when a credential provider was updated, your full governance trail. We also have access and authorization events. They capture every time a workload requests a credential. You can see the client workload making the request, the target service it was requesting access to, and if you click into these, you can see which specific access policy it was matched against. If there's a match, you'll see that it gets identified and gives you additional details such as the trust providers that were in play, access conditions that were verified, and what the credential provider is that's associated to the policy. And access authorization events capture every time a workload requests a credential. You can see the client workload, the target it was requesting access to, and which policy it matched. In this example, you can see the client workload name being identified, target service that it's requesting access to, the access policy that needs to be evaluated, and trust provider information. Thanks for watching.